Carl talked about the limited versus the radical shift in accessibility. And I'd like to offer that the limited shift is itself radical. Because what I mean by the limited shift is an utter abandonment of mobility-based evaluation for every location, for every mode, for every type of infrastructure, and for land transportation planning and the land use aspects of transportation planning. That's a pretty far-reaching vision. To offer that it's a radical shift, I would say none of our countries is yet approaching that shift, or certainly none of our countries has arrived. My own country is not even approaching that shift at this time. But the question is, if this is such a good idea, why haven't we been doing it? We've known that it's a good idea, at least since the 1970s. And we also know that there are a series of external obstacles that are arrayed against us. There are political forces that certainly impede the adoption of this kind of accessibility shift, this radical limited shift. But I want to focus today on the internal obstacles. I think that we have a number of conceptual issues in our own accessibility community that impede our ability to implement this shift, and that basically we should get our house in order. And I'm going to argue for a particular kind of order. Clearly, you can disagree with my arguments, but that understanding our own internal conceptual obstacles will go far towards furthering this accessibility shift. So let's start by defining some terms. I think the next two slides, I believe, are going to be completely consistent with what both Eric and Carl said about definitions. I just like to give it my own spin. And let's see here. A mobility improvement is an increase in the territory that can be reached for a given investment of time and money. An accessibility improvement is an increase in the value of destinations that can be reached for a given amount of time and money. That's it. Okay, this is the pared down, in my view, this is the pared down minimum for explaining what we are all about. It's very tempting to load up a lot of other things, a lot of other things that we desire onto this accessibility definition. In my opinion, those other things become impediments to the accessibility shift itself. Accessibility planning is reform in planning and transportation aspects of land use planning from a mobility to an accessibility basis, and the accessibility shift is the shift in the logic. So to use a couple of other terms that Carl used, he used the term theoretical versus impact-driven. Theoretical in my paper corresponds with inherent, impact-driven corresponds with instrumental. So let's talk about the inherent versus the instrumental benefits of accessibility. Starting with the instrumental ones, we hope that accessibility, the shift to accessibility planning, will bring about benefits such as reduced vehicle kilometers traveled, increased economic activity, improved social justice, etc. The instrumental benefit is the benefit of accessibility itself. I'm going to make a case for a higher profile for the instrumental benefit of accessibility. And I suppose in relative term that means, a higher benefit for the inherent benefit of accessibility. I suppose in relative terms that means relatively de-emphasizing the instrumental benefits. If we say that accessibility is valued to the extent that it reduces VKT, to the extent that it improves public health, etc., the implication is that without evidence of these benefits, the inherent value of accessibility is either zero or negative. We need those instrumental benefits in order to turn the value of accessibility positive. That's what we say in English, burying the lead, which means we're missing the main story. Accessibility itself is an enormous benefit, and it is the benefit of transportation systems. So it's fine to talk about the instrumental benefits, but it's not fine, in my view, to imply that the benefits of accessibility hinge on those instrumental benefits. As a practical matter, I guess I'm arguing for more accessibility on the left-hand side of our regression models. Accessibility as the dependent variable, rather than the question, what benefits does accessibility bring? Second, what I would argue is misconception. If accessibility is a resource, and a valuable resource, then that resource is a different thing from the distribution of the resource. Just like if money is a different thing than from an equitable distribution of money. By conflating equitable accessibility with accessibility, we start loading down the concept. Doesn't mean that accessibility is not relevant to equity. As Carl has shown, it's hugely relevant. But we have to analytically disentangle the concepts, engage in the accessibility shift, and then use that as a platform for increasing accessibility rather than this definitional conflation of terms. Third, I would argue misconception. I've argued for accessibility as relevant to all modes. Very commonly, this is the picture that people walk around with in their minds. It's relevant to everything but the automobile. So accessibility equals walking, or it equals transit, but it surely does not equal the automobile. I would say quite the opposite. There's an accessibility and a mobility way to plan for any mode. There's a mobility way to plan for pedestrians. In case you're wondering, it happens to be incorporated into the Highway Capacity Manual. The definition of level of service for pedestrianism has everything to do with the ability of the pedestrians to move and nothing to do with the ability of the pedestrians to reach destinations. That's the mobility way of planning for pedestrianism. Conversely, there is accessibility ways for planning for the car, which I'll get to momentarily. The fourth conceptual rationale is, I refer to this as the travel cost minimization fallacy. So people will say some version of the following. Well, if accessibility is so important, if transportation demand is in fact derived from the demand to reach destinations, why don't people minimize travel costs? This has expression in the literature that questions the derived nature of travel demand. And I make a strong defense of the derived nature of travel demand. And I argue that the evidence that's brought against the derived nature of travel demand, in fact, conflates benefits available at origins, benefits available at destinations, benefits available along routes, with an inherent benefit to travel itself. So no, we don't need to expect that individuals would be transportation cost minimizers in order for accessibility to be central to transportation planning and in order for travel demand to be derived. The next fallacy is a little more common, or maybe a lot more common on my side of the pond than here in Europe, and that's an equation of accessibility with urbanism. So many North American writers will implicitly suggest that accessibility equals a bundle of policies or even a bundle of interventions into the physical environment. So accessibility is sidewalks, and accessibility is mixed-use development, and accessibility is walkable urbanism. Accessibility surely doesn't have anything to do with long-distance auto travel, for example. If we go back to the fundamental definitions of accessibility that I put up on the board, and I believe it's consistent with the ones that were spoken about before, urbanism may be a tool to advance accessibility. I think in most cases, urbanist policies would advance accessibility policies. It doesn't follow from that that all accessibility policies are urbanist. Quite the opposite. I want you just to imagine a major job center that's 20 kilometers away and accessible only by car. Now I want you to pick it up in your mind and move it to 10 kilometers away, still accessible only by car. Clearly, this is not an urbanist solution, yet just as clearly, it's an accessibility increasing solution. So I believe we have to avoid this equation of accessibility with urbanism, or even accessibility with any predefined market basket of policies. Instead, we have to view accessibility as an approach to the evaluation of transportation and approach to the evaluation of land use. You're probably wondering what on earth this slide is all about. I think there's a misconception out there. There's a notion that accessibility metrics should be comprehensive, and the more comprehensive, the better. So as an example, one might think about, for example, healthcare accessibility. So if I am advocating this comprehensive position, I might say, well, you know, it's great that you were able to get the person to the doorstep of the clinic. But if they don't have insurance, or if there are cultural barriers between them and they getting the health care they need, they don't actually have health care accessibility. So your accessibility metrics are woefully partial. To which I would say, you're misconstruing the nature of accessibility. Accessibility is not an objective quantity in the world to be measured, like length or weight, with greater or lesser precision. Accessibility instead is like, and here's where the slide comes in, it's like an eyeglass prescription. It's useful to the extent that it fits the wearer, and it's useful to the extent that it fits the wearer's purpose. And we hope that Phil will get a set of eyeglasses that fit all of his purposes even better. So let's not assume, and the wearer for us, I would argue, are transportation and land use planners. So we would love it if everybody had health insurance. We would love it if we could eliminate cultural barriers between individuals and their healthcare providers. But we'd have to say that's probably beyond the purview of transportation and land use planners. So we look for accessibility metrics that are useful to help us do our job. Next thing that I think needs to be highlighted is the positive versus the normative aspects of accessibility. If you trace the accessibility literature back to the early 20th century, it started very normative, meaning the purpose of accessibility in those early authors in the early 20th century was to guide practice. In fact, I would offer that in many cases it was very naively normative. It was an imaginary future that somehow accessibility would be so precise that we could be very, very prescriptive about, for example, every land use and where it went. Now, those hopes have not come about, or maybe it's good that they haven't come about. But what's interesting is the normative dimension of accessibility went into hibernation after those early days. Went into hibernation, and it became strictly a positive descriptor of the world. In fact, there was even political resistance to the normative use of accessibility, including by some accessibility pioneers. Accessibility was a little bit threatening. It threatened too much governmental coordination, too much intervention into society, and too much intervention into people's lives. The normative dimension of accessibility, I would argue, based on my reading of the literature, resurfaced in the 1970s. And I think that we need to be very explicit about that normative dimension. We still have a positive tradition of research, and thank goodness that we do. But much of that research is directed towards ever refined and more sophisticated models under the assumption that putting it into practice is somebody else's job. I think we have too useful a tool to retreat to that position. I think we ought to be thinking about putting it into practice is in fact the job of research. The final obstacle I'd like to talk about, or conceptual gap, and this is the one that I'm going to purport to solve. The others I can't solve, but I hope that merely surfacing them is one step towards their resolution. Here's one that I'm going to purport to solve. It's the gap between what I call regional scenario versus project-based accessibility. And to talk about this, I'll tell a little story. My colleague Joe Grengs and I teach transportation planning at the University of Michigan. Both of us are very enthusiastic proponents of the accessibility paradigm. Needless to say, our students drink the Kool-Aid or are made to drink the Kool-Aid, and that means they buy the story, they believe the story, and they go out into the world, and they say, we hear back from them. They give us a call. They say, hey, Jonathan, I totally get it. Accessibility, not mobility, that's really, really important. Now, what am I supposed to do? And we realized that we actually didn't have a good answer to that question. The what am I supposed to do question corresponded to the right-hand picture. The what am I supposed to do question is, I'm an applied planner in local practice. When a land development is proposed, the standard transportation way of analyzing it is traffic impact analysis. So we'll project the delay that's added to intersections, the roadway delay that's added to intersections because of that new development. I know the theory about accessibility. How do I translate that into this nuts and bolts applied practice? Which led us to think that there is a gap in the accessibility literature, that most of our metrics are oriented towards what we call the regional scenario, the left-hand picture. We imagine a future regional scenario, or maybe it's a current snapshot, and the future regional scenario automatically incorporates its land use and its transportation elements. So it's not a problem to measure the accessibility of that future regional scenario under the assumptions that are going to go into the scenario. It's not the case with projects. Projects come packaged as land development projects, or they come packaged as transportation investments. How do we do accessibility when we're talking the project level? So first I'd like to talk about a couple of what I believe to be inherent differences between scenario-based and project-level accessibility. Let's see. The first is the basis of comparison. So when we talk about scenario-based accessibility, we're very aware of how to compare. We'll compare scenario A to scenario B, or maybe we'll compare our scenario to the status quo, or maybe we'll compare one metro to another metro. The basis of comparison is not a particularly difficult conundrum. When it comes to project-level accessibility, it's not at all obvious what the basis of comparison is. For example, imagine a proposed land use development with its residents. It's a residential development, and it threatens to add some congestion to the local roads, even as it brings some people closer to their destinations. So we might say, let's see. It's probably accessibility increasing because the new residents are going to be enjoying so much accessibility, but it's accessibility decreasing for existing residents because they don't get any new destinations, they just get new congestion. So how do we know if it's a net winner or not? Because we don't know the counterfactuals. We don't know the people who will live in that new development. Where do they come from? Or alternatively, the people who will live in that new development, what would they do in the absence of that new development? We don't know any of that stuff. For all these reasons, project-level accessibility doesn't have an obvious basis of comparison like scenario-based accessibility. The second dimension of project-level accessibility is, as I mentioned, projects come packaged as land use projects or transportation projects. They don't come as a nicely bundled package, as does a current snapshot, that's bundled, or a future scenario that we're going to test, that's bundled. So what that means is that at the project level, we need to track the impact of land use on transportation or transportation on land use. I refer to those as the complementary systems. If we don't do that, if we don't track the impact, for example, of land use on transportation, then we're doing a modified mobility analysis. We have to allow for our transportation to, well, for example, generate urban sprawl before we can assess whether or not we have an accessibility winner or an accessibility loser. A few related issues. Those are the two essential differences between project level and scenario based. Relatedly, we have the drop in the bucket phenomenon. So any individual project moves the accessibility needle only slightly. So we would want to have metrics that are sensitive to even slight movements and metrics that allow us to compare between different projects. Yes, I'm wrapping up. Other desirable properties, we would like our metrics to be sensitive to the kinds of regions. So some regions are small towns, some regions are big cities. We don't expect that accessibility gains in a small town would be equal to accessibility gains in the big city. So we would want metrics that are relative to their region in order to assist planners in their decision making in their regions. We would want metrics that aren't overly complex. We have planners in local practice. They don't have access to all the technical capacity. We want stuff that they can actually implement and they can actually convey. We attempted to address these problems with a metric we call accessibility elasticity, and that is the percent change in accessibility associated with the project over the percent change in population associated with the project. So you can see now that the drop in the bucket problem is no longer a problem because we're normalizing to the amount of population. And I hope you can also see that this gives one answer to the question of the basis of comparison. So the value 1.0 in this accessibility elasticity would mean an individual residing at the proposed project contributes accessibility to the region equal to the average resident of the region. And accessibility over 1 would be above the average, below 1 would be lower than the average. The basic steps that we're going to calculate accessibility. We're going to import a traffic impact analysis. So of course, we need to answer the mobility question. Mobility is always going to be an input to accessibility. That's why the two are not at odds with one another. Mobility is a necessary part of accessibility. We're going to update the regional travel time matrix, and then we're going to recalculate accessibility. Relatively simple steps. You don't need a regional travel model to do these. And just to give us an example of some results, we tested some proposed developments in my town, in Ann Arbor. So here we have a tower downtown. If you look at the traffic impact only, it was negative. In other words, this adds congestion to the roadway. If all you're doing is evaluating the development in terms of congestion, you're likely to say, oh no, this really adds too much congestion. But look at the location impact, huge, with a net impact of nearly, a resident there contributes nearly twice the accessibility to the region than the average resident. And let's see, I'll skip that and go finally to the conclusion. So I hope I've demonstrated how one can use a traffic impact analysis, but go beyond that to have an accessibility analysis of an applied nuts and bolts on the ground project, not only scenario-based accessibility. Ultimately, what are we talking about? Accessibility. Nobody is suggesting that the purpose of cities is to maximize accessibility, or the purpose of planning is to maximize accessibility. Accessibility will always exist in juxtaposition with other goals, some congruent, some competing. The point here is that to the extent that we are measuring transportation benefits, we measure them in accessibility and not mobility terms. And with that, I will open up to questions.